Hey everyone. If these scary stories helped you get nice and cozy in bed while being entertained, so don't forget to show your support by liking this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future tales. Let me know down in the comments where you were tuning in from as you got all settled in. Feel free to share any other thoughts or story ideas too. Alright, now that the wicked ritual is complete, prepare to be utterly consumed once more. I'm aware that this is unconventional. Believe me, I've tried conventional. It didn't end well for anyone. I require a certain open-mindedness that I'm hoping I might find here. But more importantly, I need my future husband to know the rules. Meet cutes are well and good on the screen, but they don't guarantee a partner's ability to follow basic instructions. That was my mistake the first time. So begging your pardon for my bluntness, I'm going to be clear about my requirements. Please read carefully. If you can't meet them, there's no point in going any further. I must want children, at least one child anyway. I'm open to the idea of more, but one is an absolute must. Must be in it for the long haul, until our child turns 18 to be precise. I understand that level of commitment is a daunting prospect, particularly when we have not yet met. After our child is born, you are welcome to ignore me if you please, or take your pleasure elsewhere. Though I will warn you that it might be difficult to come by. But you will live under my roof until our child is an adult. Homebody preferred. It will make the next 2 decades easier on you. He must have impeccable manners. I will provide a manual outlining the required etiquette, but you must at least have a grasp of basic courtesy to begin with. If you let your tongue run away with you, or don't bother to wish your neighbors a good morning when you pass them in the street, stop reading. This is not the opportunity for you. Seriously, this is the part where I should talk about myself. But let's face it, this is hardly a romantic proposal. I require commitment up front, and there's no guarantee that once we do meet, we'll really even like each other. If we do, fantastic. It'll help the years fly by. If we don't, you'll still have the main prize. Years of rent-free, expenses-free living at the Old Oak Hotel. A sanctuary has stood in this spot in one form or another since before the ley lines. During its tenure, it has been flooded, put to the flame, and pounded into dust. Time and again, it has been reimagined and rebuilt. Most of the current building dates back to Victoria's reign, though the oldest parts were constructed in the 13th century. At the very bottom of the garden, cut into the surrounding hills, there is a cave bearing handprints of red ochre. There has always been an Edwards at the hotel, though of course we haven't always gone by that name. You would think a family so tied to one place would do a better job of keeping records, but no one is certain of our origins. Perhaps it was a cosmic bargain, or perhaps mere luck. Whether good or bad, I have never been able to decide. Either way, our presence is required. Throughout our spotty past, there's a story here and there of an Edwards deserting their post, and it always coincides with a particularly brutal period of history. I inherited the position 5 years ago. At midnight on my 18th birthday, my parents took their already packed suitcases and left. I don't blame them for their abandonment. I intend to one day do the same thing to my, or hopefully our, child. They send me postcards and photos from time to time, always smiling on sunny beaches. Money isn't a concern for them. That's part of whatever mysterious deal our ancestors made. When a caretaker leaves in good standing, they will never want for anything again. They could travel the world for the rest of their lives, always sleeping in the softest sheets and dining in the finest restaurants, and never find their pockets empty. Keep this point in mind, for if you can meet my requirements, you will share my good fortune. And what must we do in return? I can all but hear you scream the question. Why, very little. The presence of an Edwards ensures that the guests can't stray from the hotel grounds. Most of our guests are live-in residents, though we do get the occasional walk-in. Where they come from, I don't know, for we are not visible to most people who stumble upon our lonely corner of the world. I've come to believe the hotel chooses to reveal itself when it's lacking entertainment, or to fill a need. Jimmy, my first husband, was one such guest. For the most part, the guests are harmless. They'll give you a little fright from time to time, popping out from a wall or turning your bathwater into blood, but I find it hard to hold it against them. I found 23 years here dreary. I can't imagine how bored I would be after 500. There are a few exceptions you should be aware of. Eric, our resident serial murderer. He claims to have been Jack the Ripper while he still drew breath, but I think he's just a blowhard. He knows better than to harm an Edwards, but I'm afraid spouses are fair game. Years ago, my grandmother managed to confine him to the 4th floor, so you will be perfectly safe from him as long as you never set foot there. Occasionally, the lift will stop on that floor, even though you haven't pressed the button for it. Do not get out. Even if the lift appears to be on fire or starts filling with murky water, wait for the doors to close again, then go to another floor. It should only take a few hours. The thing in the cellar, I don't know what it is, no one ever has. We only know it eats rats and must be fed once a day. If I'm ever ill or incapacitated, this task will fall to you. Harvest the rats from the traps in the garden, then stand at the cellar door and throw them down the stairs. Do not walk down the stairs, and do not forget to feed it. You don't want to be the first person to see its face. Mrs. Jones, old-fashioned and a stickler for manners. She's the reason I'm advertising for a husband rather than a boyfriend. She won't abide a couple living in sin under the same roof as her. Really though, she's a sweet old thing. Full of stories about the war and always ready to help if I get stuck on a recipe. I don't blame her for what happened with Jimmy at all. I'd warned him enough times. Guests aside, there are other rules you will need to follow to ensure a safe, satisfactory stay at the Old Oak Hotel. They are listed in a book that has been repenned many times over the centuries. If you choose to accept this opportunity, I will insist that you read it until you can recite the pages word for word. However, there are some rules so critical for your survival that I feel compelled to list them here. With the exception of the 4th floor, you are welcome to roam the hotel and its grounds as you please, but you must never set foot outside of our land. Not until our child is old enough to fulfill their duties. If I were to do so, it would unleash pandemonium, plague, peril, perhaps another world war. I'm afraid you would be less crucial to the fate of the world, but it would certainly be a personal disaster. Never look in the mirrors in room 33. I've touched this point already, but it bears repeating. Never be rude to Mrs. Jones. Failure to observe that last rule is what got Jimmy. She doted on him. I think he reminded her of her long-dead son, for she pampered him as if he were one of her own. Each morning, she had breakfast ready for him before I had so much as opened my eyes, and she developed a habit of trailing along after him, complimenting his skill as he oiled rusted hinges or set a crooked picture straight. At first, Jimmy basked in the attention, but by the end of his 2nd month, he was growing bored of Mrs. Jones, me, and the hotel itself. We pride ourselves on our facilities. If you need more activity than a turn around the garden, we have a lovely indoor pool. It freezes over every now and then, but most of the time it's perfectly usable. Our library is unmatched. Although the room is cramped, it has every book imaginable. You only need to think of a particular title, and it will appear on one of the shelves. And now that I've dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century, we have a wide array of streaming services. It wasn't enough for Jimmy. He wanted to go out, eat in a restaurant, watch a film in the cinema, see any faces other than the ones he was surrounded by every day. He began having a drink each evening. One drink turned into several, and after a few weeks, the bar became his permanent residence between dusk and midnight. He wasn't the only one getting bored. I had been thrilled when he first arrived, ecstatic when he agreed to stay. How marvelous to feel real flesh beneath my fingers after 5 years of only the dead for company. What a relief to have some assistance in the many tasks required to keep the hotel running as it should. The more he drank, the less inclined he was to help, or even spend time in my company. He no longer visited my bed, choosing a room for himself on the opposite end of the floor. When our paths did cross, at best he would ignore me. At worst, he would nitpick or outright rail against me, blaming me for his captivity. Still, I made an effort to be present whenever he frequented the bar. As lovely as Mrs. Jones can be, she does have a tendency to nag. Before and after her death, she was close to teetotal, only consenting to take a single sherry at Christmas, and drinking outside of special occasions is something of a bugbear of hers. "Think of your health, dear," she would tell Jimmy brusquely. "You'll miss it when it's gone." Or, How about we switch to a nice apple juice now? You've had quite enough to drink for one night. Most of the time, Jimmy managed to pull himself together enough to flash a charming smile and distract her with a compliment about her latest meal. But after one drink too many, I'd noticed him gritting his teeth and just barely managing to hold his tongue. It was better if I was present. Playing the doting wife, I insisted on pouring his drinks, watering them down out of his sight. When Mrs. Jones's nagging bordered on relentless, I could always distract her with a game of gin rummy. On his final day, I was running behind. The ghoul on the second floor, usually the least demanding of our guests, had come down with some dreadful illness, or else decided he wanted to inconvenience me. Either way, I had woken that morning to the foulest stench I had ever experienced. I followed it to his room and found every surface covered in putrid green blank gunge, its consistency somewhere between mucus and vomit. All day I scrubbed, taking only brief breaks to step outside before I fainted. By the time the room was restored to a passable state, and I had filled several bin bags to bursting with filthy rags, it was already deep into the night. Mindful of the time, I paused only long enough to wash the streaks of muck from my arms and face before racing to the bar. I arrived just in time to hear Jimmy's last words. After he spat them at Mrs. Jones, she only stared for a small eternity, her mouth frozen in the motherly smile she wore whenever she scolded him. Then, like melted wax, her face began to shift. I shouted at Jimmy to run, but he didn't need to be told. Before the words left my mouth, he leapt from his bar stool and streaked through the door. Mrs. Jones followed him seconds later. Her lips were already peeling back to reveal rows upon rows of long, wickedly sharp fangs, while claws sprouted from beneath her lace-edged cuffs. I sprinted after them, but Jimmy was fueled by fear, and Mrs. Jones by whatever force propels the Mrs. Joneses of the world. I followed the screeching to the lobby. Breathless, I arrived to see he had arrived within mere feet of the entrance before Mrs. Jones grabbed him. Claws wrapped around his throat, she lifted him into the air. As I watched, her jaw unhinged, the lower part dropping so that it was nearly level with her chest. That sight drove all the sense out of my head. Forgetting every rule my parents had ever drilled into me, I lunged at her. She batted me away as though I weighed no more than a fly. I crashed into the reception desk, the breath bursting from my lungs in a great whoosh. I was certain that I would die, for no amount of effort seemed to force air back into my aching chest. At last, as my vision began to dim, I managed to take a small gulp, then another and another, until I was able to draw myself together enough to regain my feet. By that time, Mrs. Jones had nearly finished her dinner. Jimmy's chest was splayed open, muscle and shattered ribs protruding every which way from his flesh, and she was devouring the last few bites of his heart. His head was angled towards me. The light had winked out from his eyes, but they still held his final terror, and an accusation which, I was quite certain, was directed at me. I would like to say I felt only horror, but I couldn't help my sudden jolt of irritation. How many times had I told him to mind his manners? Mrs. Jones gulped, the sound thick and wet in her gullet, and dropped what remained of Jimmy to the floor. Then she turned to me. Here's another rule for you, one which I hope you never have cause to use. Never interfere with a kill. The Mrs. Jones who used to kiss my grazed knees, who argued with my mother for the right to read me bedtime stories, was no longer at the wheel. No amount of pleading or reasoning would move her. I could only run. Spinning around, I vaulted over the reception desk and raced for the office behind it. If Jimmy had not been out of his mind with fear and booze, he might have remembered the rules and survived. It was one of several staff-only rooms throughout the hotel warded to keep out unwanted guests. Just 10 steps from desk to door, yet it was the longest journey of my life. My hard-won breath burned my throat. My heart pounded in my ears, deafening me to all other sounds than Mrs. Jones's heavy, pounding footsteps. Grasping the handle, her hot, copper-tanged breath was on my neck. Fire exploded in my flesh as she raked her claws down my back. A step further away and I wouldn't have made it. The pain would have been too great. But I managed managed to throw myself into the office and slam the door before crumpling to the ground. Before I passed out, I heard her grunting and shrieking outside, furious that she couldn't get in. 3 days I spent in the office, emerging only to feed the thing in the cellar, before scurrying back to my hiding place. Whenever I left, I tried not to look at the mangled heap that used to be Jimmy. There was no avoiding the smell, though. With no small difficulty, and the help of a first aid kit, I managed to treat and bandage the wounds on my back. They bled sluggishly all throughout the first day, but thankfully didn't fester. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a tentative knock on the door, followed by the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps. I waited until they had disappeared down the corridor before cracking the door open. On the floor was a freshly baked Victoria sponge and a beautifully written note of apology. It took every ounce of courage I possessed, but that evening I forced myself to go to the dining room. Mrs. Jones was waiting for me, her eyes red-rimmed, a steaming cottage pie on the table. I tried not to flinch as she took my hand, reiterating the apology she had already delivered in writing. The next morning she helped me clean Jimmy up. We treated each other cautiously for a while, but eventually we got back to playing gin rummy again. When the scars on my back twinge, as they sometimes do, she helps me rub a soothing ointment into them. Even though I've told her it's not necessary, she apologizes every time. So you've heard my story and you have my proposal. If you think you could be the man for me, I invite you to visit. You will need to drink a cup of ram's blood. A pinch of nutmeg makes it a little more tolerable. And light a black candle before bedtime. When you next wake, you will find yourself at our gates. As travel arrangements go, it's hardly the Orient Express, but it beats the airfare. If you have read this without flinching, if you can stomach the journey to get here, if you walk up to our door and find the nerve to open it, I have one more instruction for you. Just as you enter, look to your right. You will see a deep brown stain on the lobby carpet. I've scrubbed and scrubbed, but it just won't come out. Perhaps that's for the best. It's a good reminder of what will happen to you should you call Mrs. Jones a nosy old bat. And when you run into Jimmy, as you will, for he still likes hanging around the bar in the evening, his silvery wounds glistening as though they had just been inflicted, don't let him convince you he was some sort of victim. He knew the rules. I wasn't always a psychopath. Neither was Adam. There were 10 of us, 5 Adams and 5 Eves handcuffed together in a room with no doors. When I opened my eyes, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, my name was Eve. I had no other names but Eve. There were 9 bodies spread around me, including a boy. A lump attached to me, curled into a ball. Our real identities were lost, though I could recall small things, tiny splinters still holding on. I saw a dark room filled with twinkling fairy lights, a bookshelf decorated with titles I never read, boxes of prescribed medication sticking from an overflowing trash can. The walls were covered in sticky notes and calendars, a chalkboard bearing a countdown to a date that had long since passed. I thought you were going to try this time. Why do you make it so hard? The voice was a ghost in my head. She didn't have a name, barely an identity, but my heart knew her. She existed as a shadow right in the back of my mind, suppressed deep down. With her, I remembered the rain soaking my face and my pounding footsteps through dirt. When I tried to dive deeper inside these splinters, I hit a wall. It should have confused me, angered me, but I couldn't feel anger. There was only a sense of melancholy that I had lost someone close to me. With no proper memories, though, I didn't feel sad. I wasn't the first one awake. There were others, but neither of us spoke, trapped inside our own minds. Drawing my knees to my chest, I wondered what the others were feeling and thinking. Did they have loved ones they couldn't fully remember? I did know one thing. There was something wrong with my body, the bones in my knees cracking when I moved them. Everything felt stiff and wrong, my neck giving a satisfying popping noise when I tipped my head left to right. The room was made of glass, 4 glass walls casting 4 different versions of me. It was like looking into a fun mirror, each variant of me growing progressively more contorted, a monster blinking back. There was a metal thing wrapped around my wrist, and when I tugged it, the lump next to me groaned. I noticed the handcuff and the lump when I was half awake, but I thought I was hallucinating. The lump had breath that smelled of garlic coffee, and he snored. Adam, my mind told me. The lump's name was Adam. Everything about me felt new. Like a blank slate, I had no real thoughts or memories. The boy attached to me was different from the others. Adam was dressed in the same bland clothes, but his had color. A single streak of bright red stained his shirt. I found myself poking it, and he leaned back, his eyes widening. The red was dry, ingrained into the material, which meant at some point Adam had been bleeding. Not a lot, and he didn't look like he had any wounds. I studied him, or, I guess, we studied each other. He was a wiry brunette with freckles and zero flaws, like his face had been airbrushed. This wasn't the natural kind of airbrush. I could see where someone or something had attempted to scrape away his freckles too. The skin of his left cheek a raw pinkish color. I wasn't a stranger to this thing either. I could see where several spots on my face had been surgically removed. The boy glued to my side was an enigma in a room drowned of color. The red on him made him stand out in a sea of white, a mystery I immediately wanted to solve. I couldn't help it. Prodding the guy's face, running my finger down his cheek and stabbing my nail under his nose for signs of bleeding. I was curious, and curiosity didn't belong in the white room full of blank slates. I wondered if the old me looked for that kind of thing. Her bookshelf was full of horror and crime thriller, an entire box set of a detective series my mind wasn't allowed to remember. There was that wall again, this time slamming down firmly on the room with the fairy lights. There was too much of me in my fragmented memory. The girl who wasn't Eve. I wasn't fully aware that I was violently prodding Adam, until he wafted my hand away. The boy opened his mouth to speak, his eyes narrowing with irritation, before his mind reminded him that irritation did not exist in the white room. I watched the anger in his eyes fizzle out, and he frowned at me, adapting the expression of a baby deer. I think he was trying to be angry, trying to yell at me. When I realized he couldn't swear, or didn't know how to swear, he distanced himself from me, turning his back and folding his arms. I got the hint, shuffling away, only for the handcuffs to violently snap us back together. This is a recorded message stated by the United States government on 8/27/2023 regarding the Adam and Eve project. Please listen carefully. This message will not be repeated. A text-to-speech voice drew my attention to the ceiling, and next to me, Adam let out a quiet hiss. You have been unconscious for 35 days and 16 hours, following awakening. It is recommended that you remain where you are. The voice was pre-recorded, but it definitely sounded aimed toward the Adam who was crawling towards a door that looked like a wall. But I could see the subtle glint of a handle. 200 years ago, on April 5, 2023, NASA announced the discovery of Blue Sky, a potentially hazardous NEO, near-Earth object, was estimated to miss our planet, flying by at just 19,000 miles, approx 30,000 in kilometers. 200 years ago, the robot's voice wasn't fully registering in my brain. The text-to-speech voice paused, and a screen lit up in front of us displaying Blue Sky, and then flickering to several news screens. CBS, NBC, Fox News, and BBC, all with red banners and panicked-looking presenters. However, during its passing, the Blue Sky asteroid's collision course changed, striking our planet on April 13, 2023, causing global destruction and a mass extinction event. A screen showed us the entirety of the West Coast underwater. New York, London, Seoul, Tokyo, all of them, either wiped from the map or uninhabitable. Wait, I wasn't expecting Adam to speak, his voice more of a croak. His eyes widened, like he was remembering who he was before Adam. That's Apophis. He scratched the back of his head. 2029. Adam's random declaration of words and numbers intrigued me. I inclined my head, motioning for him to continue, but he just shot me a look. Adam was a lot better at emotions than me. What? You said something. My own voice was a static whisper. He blinked, narrowing his eyes. No, I didn't. Turning away from the boy, I decided to ignore him and all of his future declarations. I should have been terrified, mourning the loss of not just my loved ones, but my entire planet. But I didn't have any memories of the world except the rain and a dark bedroom filled with fairy lights. I could have been a traveler, visiting every country and documenting each one. All of that had been taken away, and yet I couldn't feel sad or betrayed. Why would I mourn a planet I didn't remember? Please listen carefully, the voice continued. You have been carefully selected in a choosing process for the Adam and Eve program, humanity's last chance of survival. 200 years ago, you were cryogenically frozen in an attempt to restart in a new world. Presently for you, the Earth is estimated to be habitable. When the lights flickered off, the screen lit up, displaying exactly what the voice said. A new world, and the bluest sky stretching out across a never-ending horizon. I found myself transfixed, smiling dazedly at brand new oceans and newly formed continents. We ask this, the message crackled, on behalf of the President of the United States. Will you do what we couldn't? Will you make the new world a better place? Will you fix the mistakes of your predecessors and restart our sick world? I heard my reply before I was aware of the word in my mouth. Yes, the screen was brighter. That beautiful blue sky so hard to look away from. Will you create humans you are proud of? Yes, yes. Adam's murmur followed mine, the others echoing. Will you be our future hope? Will you destroy every human being who goes against the new earth and spill blood in the name of Adam and Eve? Yes. The room flooded with light, and I blinked rapidly, drool seeping down my chin. It was the voice's next words that tore away my mind. It is with great displeasure, however, that we must inform you there are limited resources in our stockpile. The ceiling opened up, a large ratty bag dropping onto the ground. It was a brand new color, but this time a moldy green. Something snapped in two inside my mind. It didn't belong in the new world. It was poison from our predecessors. I backed away with the others, yanking Adam with me. At first he didn't move, cross-legged. A smile stretched across his lips. I don't think he noticed the bag. He was starry-eyed, unblinking at the screen still filled with the new world. Our new world. That was ours to mold into our own. There is no need for panic, the voice said. Consider this bag an artifact of the lost world. There is nothing to fear. Fear? I wasn't sure I knew what that was. Did my old self feel fear running through the rain? Did I feel fear witnessing my planet burn right in front of me? There can only be one Adam and one Eve in the new world. The voice continued. Please choose among yourselves. You have 2 minutes. I didn't experience fear when the tranquility in the white room dissolved. Adam violently pulled me to my feet when an Eve with a blonde bob dove inside the bag and pulled out a gun. She shouldn't have been able to use it. Our memories were gone. Our old selves' footprints in the sand. But it was the way her fingers expertly wrapped around the butt that made me think otherwise. The Eve didn't hesitate, and with perfect aim, blew the heads off of 2 Adams, and then another Eve. I watched more color splatter and pool and stain the white room, bodies falling like dominoes. When an Eve stepped toward me, my Adam pulled me across the room, dipped into the bag, his fingers wrapped around a machete. He threw me a gun, and another Adam dived for it. Still no fear. I ducked and grabbed it, my hands working for me, shooting the Adam between the eyes. I realized what we needed to do to survive. But it wasn't fear that made me kill. It was necessary for the new Earth. The words were in my head, suffocating my thoughts. We had limited resources. There was no screaming, no crying or begging. And Eve knocked me onto my face, but there was no pain. She kicked me in the head, plunging her knife into the back of my leg. Still no pain. Blood stained me running down my chin. No pain. I didn't think. I just acted. 1 Adam and Eve left, and they were hardest to take down. The Eve circled me, eyes narrowed, calculating my every move. Adam and I communicated through nods and head gestures. Adam told me to go for the sandy-haired Adam, while he would take a swipe at an Eve. I was taken off guard when the Adam surrendered, only to kick me onto my back, knocking Adam off balance too. I thought we were going to die. but my Adam had been following and predicting their every move. Back to back, I reached for my gun. 2 bullets left. I managed to get Eve straight through her left eye. I didn't notice we were the only ones left until the walls were stained red, my hands coated with Adam's and Eve's, and the final Adam was lying in a stemming pool of blood. I had pieces of skulls stuck in my hair, and I was out of breath, but I felt a sense of triumph. There was so much blood, but it was the blood of the old world. Both of us knew that. Adam turned to me, his eyes filled with stars, his skin stained red. I thought he was going to hug me, but his gaze found the screen where our new world awaited us. The 2 of us were breathless, awaiting the next instructions. But none came. I counted hours, and then a full day. Adam had gotten progressively less appealing the longer I stayed isolated with him. He sat against the wall with his knees to his chest, head of matted curls against the wall. The 2 of us suffocating in the stink from the slow decomposition around us. The other Adams and Eves were in their first stage, bloating. How did I know that? 20, Adam kept muttering to himself over and over again. It was the same number repeatedly. I couldn't feel anger or irritable, but I was confused why he was saying it. Another day went by, and I was starting to feel deeply suppressed hunger start to bleed through. I watched Adam counting to himself, his eyes closed, feet tapping on the floor, and wondered if the new world would accept cannibalism. Adam stared at himself in the fun mirror a lot, making noises with his mouth. I wasn't fully concentrating when he turned to me, blurting, "How big was Apophis again?" To me his words were alien, and I ignored him. But then he started talking again, spewing random words. Huntley Diving Center, med school, cheese sandwich, man with a bald head. When I told him to stop, he continued. Van, cheese sandwich. Pretty little liars. He knocked his head against the wall. Professor Jacobs told me to go, but I didn't want to go. I told him I'd call the cops, and then I'm seeing Silver. Adam, I said, stop. Bad news, he whispered. Very bad news I'm not allowed to tell anyone. Adam, I think I was irritated. Adam sighed, closing his eyes. United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru. His gaze tracked the screen in front of us. Republic Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Greenland, El Salvador too. We found them. And Adam's voice, a human voice, ripped me from slumber. Over here! Thundering footsteps followed and something in my gut twisted. I stood up, swaying. Adam followed, half-lidded eyes barely finding mine. His expression was new. I think mine was too. Fear. Humans. Before I knew what was happening, I was being grabbed by masked men who were surprisingly gentle. Humans. I didn't know what to say. I asked them how they survived the asteroid impact, and they told me to stay calm. Adam was behind me, his arms pinned behind his back. He was being told to stay calm, but Adam was calm. He may have been nodding along to the human's words, but he was thinking exactly what I was. When an Eve cupped my cheeks and asked if I was okay, my gaze flicked to my discarded gun. Oliva! She was yelling in my face. Sweetie, you're in shock. Can you tell me how many fingers I'm holding up? I nodded dizzily, unable to tear my gaze from my weapon. 5. There could only be one Adam and one Eve. I felt fear for the first time when Adam and I were led through large silver doors and into blinding sunlight. When it faded and my eyes found clarity, I wasn't seeing breathtaking views of mountains and newly formed oceans. Across the road, a woman was walking her dog. A school bus flew past. Then an ambulance. A long line of traffic snaking down the road. I could smell Chinese food, my mouth watering, when Adam started screaming. My fear came back, and it was enough to unravel me completely, sending me to my knees. I was still stained in blood, wrapped in a blanket I could barely feel. My mind that had been ripped apart, that had splintered for the good of our humanity, was starting to crumble. Humanity didn't need fucking saving. It only truly hit me when I was sitting in the back of a cop car, Adam in the front seat, that I wasn't a last savior of our species. The Earth was still spinning, still alive in modern-day 2023, and I was just Eve, the Eve who sat next to me in the back of the car, gently rubbing my hands, told me my name was Olivia. I was a 24-year-old student, and I had been missing for 3 years. Adam's name was Kai. He was 23 and a med student. No, we were Adam and Eve. I spent a while in another white room, but this time I wasn't forced to kill people. I was told I had been through brutal torture I could not remember. I told her that was impossible, and then she calmly showed me my legs and arms. I was covered in burns, old and new bruises, my body sliced open and stitched up. With this abuse, my kidnappers had successfully turned me into a shell of myself. I was asked if I wanted therapy to revisit those memories, but I declined. I was happy being Eve, even if it was just for a while. I saw Adam several times, but he was never fully conscious, either strapped to a bed muttering to himself or cross-legged on the floor, head tipped back. I was 2 months into my treatment when he barged into my room. 2029, Adam said, his words slurring, is when Apophis is going to hit us. I nodded slowly, dropping the book I was reading. My re-education was going well. I was getting my emotions back, which of course included annoyance. It's going to miss us. Think! Adam hissed, pressing his finger to his lips. Gotta be quiet! Shh! Shutting the door painfully slowly like he was in a cartoon skit. Adam stumbled over to my bed, prodding at his neck. They stabbed me, he said in a manic giggle. But I'm not stupid. I'm smart. I'm like so smart, and it's been driving me crazy, but now I see it. Adam leaned forward. Apophis, 2029, he said, his breath tickling my cheek. Is why we were taken. He burst out laughing. Can't you see? April 2029, 19,000 miles. A big lump of space rock going zoom. He stopped laughing, slamming his fist into his palm. Impact. Bang! Adam's eyes widened, his expression crumpling. Help me, he whispered, before crumpling into a heap, and then dragged out by several Eves in white. According to them, he was experiencing mild side effects from treatment. Unlike me, Adam chose to get his memories back. Yeah, that's not a good idea. Olivia's mind was too much, too painful. My old life started to seep back in the form of loved ones as I was slowly deconditioned. I stopped referring to boys and girls and Adams and Eves, and was firmly told the new Earth was just fantasy. All of the destruction I saw generated with AI. I have a girlfriend who visited me every day. She said I didn't have to take the therapy, but I know she wants me to remember Olivia. Her name is Charlie, and when I was released from the White Room, she took me back to our shared house. I have 2 roommates, Sam and Matt. Both of them kept their distance for a while, especially when I accidentally referred to them as Adams. I'm still getting letters from the facility politely inviting me for a therapy session. I'm ignoring them, but I have started seeing a single black van outside our house. I think my kidnappers are back and I'm terrified. The facility told me to call them as soon as I see anyone suspicious. I've told Charlie and the guys to hide upstairs, and right now I'm in our living room. It's pitch black outside, but I can see a figure standing directly outside our house. I've turned off all the lights. Every time I blink, I swear they're getting closer. I think whoever wants a new world has come back for me. My husband is a painter. Well, that's a stretch. He does very modern Jackson Pollock-style art. I've seen him in the studio, and he's not so much painting as he is flinging paint at the canvas with his bare hands. Strangely, though, people pay real money for his work. His most recent one, gray and blue splatters on a gray canvas entitled Ocean Dawn, fetched us a cool $3,000. He makes a full salary off his work, and then some. I don't get it. Maybe the people who buy his work are smarter or more cultured than me. They all fit a very specific type, well-dressed men with distinguished salt and pepper hair, petite blonde wives that look like they've never eaten a slice of cake in their lives. Money to burn, put on the dog types. Although, if it's a choice between one of my husband's paintings and a Louis Vuitton purse, well, his paintings are marginally less ugly than those purses. Man, what is it with rich people and ugly stuff? Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here. The reason why I'm writing this is because my husband has been away for the past 2 weeks visiting family. While he's been gone, I've been running the business by myself, and I've noticed some odd things. His studio is a really nice space downtown, large and full of light, filled ceiling to floor with his paintings, and even though they're individually ugly, there's something sort of beautiful about them being all together. The different colors and splattering types all match and coordinate with each other. It's obvious they're all done by the same artist. Maybe that's why he makes money off them. They have a distinct style. You can point to one and say with certainty, that's a Theodore Waters painting. The thick globs of paint, the colors that don't really go with each other, that's a Waters right there. I could put on a smock and throw paint at a canvas while listening to Gregorian chants too. But I wouldn't be able to produce paintings that consistently resembled each other in style. The first few days went well. We had a minor hiccup. I almost gave the woman buying Evening Tranquility the wrong painting. They looked identical to me. But I was enjoying it. After work, I'd head to the studio for a few hours and binge dramas on Hulu, waiting for the next client to come by. Things took a turn for the worse, however, on Wednesday night. My iPad ran out of battery 20 minutes before the last client was supposed to show up. So I just sat there, staring at the paintings. I got up and rearranged them a little. I pulled out the piece that was supposed to be sold tonight, Midnight Dream. It was one of the less ugly ones, if only for its color scheme. Black canvas, or possibly navy blue, splattered with purple, mauve, indigo, and white, and just a few dots of ocean blue, drizzling across the front. I leaned it against the other paintings, and sat back at the desk, taking off my glasses and rubbing my eyes. Damn allergies. When I looked back up, however, I froze, with my glasses off. Midnight Dream was now blurry, and with all the random splatters blurred now, I could see a clear shape. How there were less splatters, more darkness, in the center of the canvas. That looked exactly like the silhouette of a person. A person leaned over the viewer, staring down at them. What the? I put my glasses back on. But with all the clear dots and drizzles and specks, I could only barely make out the image. Was that why people were buying Theodore's paintings? Because there was a second hidden image? It didn't make sense, though. I'd seen Theodore making some of these paintings. He was randomly flinging paint on a canvas, listening to those calming Gregorian chants or whatever they were. There was no way he could plan where the paint fell to create a second image, unless he was somehow going back and painting over some of the paint splatters later, though I didn't see any brushstrokes to imply that. I got up and pulled out another one of Theodore's paintings, entitled Pink Marble Splatters of Pink and Red and White. I leaned it against Midnight Dream, stepped back, and took off my glasses. It was a hand covered in splatters of blood. My stomach did a little flip. I felt nauseous. It's just art, I told myself. People do extreme art all the time. What about that one where that giant guy is eating a man? That's like in an art museum and everything, right? Nothing wrong with painting a bloody hand. Nothing wrong with painting a shadow person glaring down at you. And maybe I was wrong. There wasn't much detail in these images, just the suggestion of forms. It could be pareidolia, my brain assigning familiar shapes to the paintings. Like a Rorschach test. Maybe these were random blobs and it was just my imagination. I took out another painting. This one was pretty ugly. Muddy shades of brown and green around the edges. A big pink blob in the middle. Spring Blooms was the title. I leaned it against pink marble and stepped back. Closed my eyes, let out a breath. Took off my glasses. I opened my eyes. Oh no. The pinkish blob, now blurred and at a distance, was clearly the shape of a woman's body, laying on the ground, splattered with blood. Why would he paint this? And who would buy this? Who would want a painting of a dead body in their home? I swallowed, my throat dry. I put on my glasses and slid the painting back in with the others stacked up. Was this the reason Theodore was actually making money? He was selling these paintings to sickos that were camouflaged well enough to stay hung up through dinner parties and visits from the in-laws? I texted the client who was supposed to pick up Midnight Dream and told them I wasn't feeling well. Then I drove home, stomach twisting, and locked myself inside. But I didn't exactly feel safe in the house either, because Theodore had a few of his own paintings hanging on our walls. I realized now, as I viewed them from a distance, that the painting in our living room depicted a close-up of a woman's face, but something black was oozing out of her mouth. Vomit, a spider, not enough detail to tell, and the huge one in our bedroom, hanging above our bed, looked like two lovers embracing, except they appeared dead. From the ashen gray tint of their bodies, this was sick, and it didn't even make sense. I remembered when Theodore painted this one, the one of the lovers. I had watched him for more than an hour. He was just flinging paint randomly as he listened to the weird chanting music he always played. Yet the blobby shapes clearly suggested two people embracing. I decided to sleep in the guest room that night, but before I did, I made the mistake of walking into Theodore's home studio. I'd left the lights on somehow, so I stepped into the studio, my heart pounding. It was a lot more cramped than the one downtown, only about 100 square feet, with a huge stack of paintings in the corner. As I reached for the light switch, I noticed the unfinished piece on the easel. I'd seen it several times over the last few weeks, but now I saw it differently. I took off my glasses and took a few steps back, out into the darkened foyer. It was a woman, lying on a dark wooden floor, splattered in blood. Except that woman was me. Of course I couldn't be sure. There wasn't enough detail. But from the colors, that looked like my favorite gray sweater. My hair splayed out on the floor. I backed away. Then I ran out of the house. I drove all night until I got to a friend's place. That's where I am now. Theodore has tried to call me, but I've let all his calls go to voicemail. Every time I close my eyes, I see the painting. The splatters of paint that look just like my dead body. Let me just start by saying my 6-year-old son and I are very close. From an extremely young age, he has been able to sympathize with me, and has been extremely emotionally intelligent. The thing is, it's not with everyone. It's just me. He feels like just a regular boy with everyone else, but he always knows what to say when I'm having a hard day. I try not to show it, but he somehow knows. Emotional intelligence is how I've always played it off. But now I'm not so sure anymore. Since my son could talk and form sentences, he has said things to me that he should have no way of knowing. It started out with him saying things like, "Mommy, don't worry, I still think you are pretty." That day, I was really struggling with my body image. I put on a few pounds and hated myself. Of course, I didn't let my son see me crying in the mirror or grabbing the rolls on my stomach. I mean, little boys always think their mother is beautiful, right? It's not like he knew. Soon after that, he mentioned to me that he missed Bethany. I asked him who Bethany was, and he looked at me like I was crazy. He told me it was his sister who died. My son never had a sister. However, I had a sister who died at 16 whose name was Bethany. I never mentioned it to him. I thought maybe it was a fluke. Next, I lost my job. Once again, he had no clue it happened. I was reading him a bedtime story and he put his hand over the book and looked up at me. He got a serious look on his face and said, "It'll be okay. You'll find a job next week and it'll pay better too." It felt weird that he found out about the job loss, but I didn't think much about it. Once I did, in fact, get a job next week that also paid better, I was weirded out. I asked my mother about it, and she said it's probably just the close bond that a mom and son always have. Kids are weird. Every parent has their own story of a time when their kid said something terrifying to them. She tried to explain to me. A few months ago, it started to become an everyday thing where he would say something about a subject he shouldn't know. Then about a month ago, it went from him knowing things he shouldn't, to him saying things like, "I remember when I was a girl and I loved the color purple. I remember when I was a mommy and I cried a lot. I remember when I was a mommy and I wanted to run away." This felt weird to me. It wasn't like he thought he was a girl. I asked him once why he thought he was a girl. He looked at me frustrated and said, "I'm not a girl now, I was a girl before I was a boy." He kept telling me stories of all the things he did when he was a girl. He would tell me things about myself that I've never told anybody, even my husband. When I told my husband I was starting to get scared of my son, he said I was being dramatic. I guess it doesn't help my case that I didn't tell my husband everything my son said to me. When he said things like missing his dead sister, that was one thing. But well, let's just say I've not always been a saintly woman. I have a past, We have all done things we aren't proud of, but my husband doesn't know about these things. First of all, I stole a lot as a teenager. Nothing too crazy. I think a lot of teenagers do that honestly. The more serious things I kept from him are, I got a DUI in college. My ex has a restraining order over me. I was a stripper for several years. And worst of all, I cheated on my husband a few years ago. It was dumb, and I regret it. But I will never tell him. My son had mentioned doing all these things when he was a girl, or when he was a mommy. Of course in child terms, but nonetheless he described all those things. He hasn't mentioned much to anyone else, mostly just me. He hasn't come right out and said that he was me or anything. If he were me, maybe he doesn't realize it. Maybe he just has random fuzzy memories of another life. Last week I noticed he seemed down. He wasn't really talking like he normally does. I felt like a terrible mother. I was thankful he wasn't talking. It felt like every time I talked to him, I got more and more scared of him. One day, he crawled into my bed with me in the morning. He took a deep sigh and looked at me. I remember when I was a mommy and that car hurt me tomorrow. My heart sank and I didn't even know what to say, but I mustered up the courage. "Honey, what is going to happen to me tomorrow?" I said while pushing away the hair falling in his face as a nervous tick. "I remember it hurting so bad. I don't want you to feel the pain too. Don't go, don't do it." I sat looking him deep in his eyes. My bed, which felt so warm and comforting a few minutes ago, now felt cold and hard. What was going to happen to me? I kept asking him what was going to happen to me. Every time I asked, he got more and more upset. My husband woke up after I asked him for the 5th time. He got so mad at me. I can't blame him. I was clutching our son's shoulders and screaming. Tell me, I said over and over and over again. My son didn't talk to me for the rest of the day. The next day I tried to explain to my husband what our son said and how I was scared, because this was the first time my husband heard of my son saying such crazy things. He didn't believe I was in danger. We had dinner plans with some friends that night. It was the last thing I wanted to do. I figured since my son mentioned a car, I needed to just stay away from them at all costs. I tried to convince my husband I was sick, but he of course didn't believe me. I should have said I was sick from the very beginning, and not told him the real reason for wanting to stay home. My son's babysitter made it to the house. As we said our goodnights to our boy, he gave me a sad hug. Not only that, but he couldn't take his eyes off my left hand. After our hug, he grabbed my fingers and squeezed them tightly. I knew something was about to happen to my hand. I felt like I could anticipate the pain. We walked out the door, and my husband guided me to the car door. He opened it up and helped me in. Although it didn't feel like he was trying to be a gentleman, it felt like he was scared that I was going to run. He wasn't wrong. After a few minutes of driving, I felt the anxiety building. I felt sick. At a stoplight, I noticed the car door was unlocked. I slipped off my heels and opened the car door. I was trying to move way faster than my feet could take me. I didn't see the curb and tripped over, face planting in the process. My husband came running over to help me up. I thought he would be mad that I tried to run away. I thought he would call me a brat or worse. But he didn't. He could see how scared I was. He realized it didn't matter if what I was feeling was real or not. But he needed to respect my fear and worry. He tried to help me back into the car. He said we would go back home, but I refused to go in the car. I told him we had to walk. This is when he started to get frustrated. He felt like he did his best to compromise and emphasize with my anxieties. But he wasn't willing to walk 2 miles home in 40-degree weather at 7 p.m. Looking back, I understand why he was so annoyed. He grabbed my shoulders and took a deep breath. He started nudging me back to the car. The nudging turned into pushing, and the pushing turned into forcing. I was pushing back and doing everything in my power to not go into the car. I was kicking and screaming. A few other cars pulled over to help. I'm sure they were thinking something much worse was actually happening. Before anyone could get to me, he got me into the car. As he was slamming the door, I reached out my hand to try and stop it. The next few minutes were so fuzzy. I could feel my hand pulsing. I could vaguely hear my husband screaming and apologizing profusely, followed by strangers separating us and trying to help. An ambulance showed up a few minutes later, and that's when I noticed my hand. My index, middle, and ring fingers had been smashed in the car door. Half of my middle finger was completely gone. We went to the ER and about 80% of my fingers were saved, luckily. If it wasn't obvious, my husband felt terrible. Not only for what happened to my fingers, but for being so aggressive with me and not listening to me. I know I should have been more bothered, but I have other family members I'm more worried about. After that, I accepted that I needed to take what my son said about my future seriously. That week, he said more disturbing things. I remember when I was a mommy and I set the house on fire. I remember when I was a mommy and I stabbed my husband. I remember when I was a mommy and the scary man took me into the forest. I remember when I was a mommy and the monster from the closet hurt me. I was terrified of the things that would happen to me. I know children can't always describe or articulate words that well at a young age, but that didn't help me feel any better. I tried to ask him for details of what he meant, but once he said something, he usually didn't want to talk about it anymore, especially if it seemed to be traumatizing. It's like the memory would flash in his head, and it had to blurt it out. The reason I'm writing all this out in the first place is because of what he told me today. The two of us were coloring at the kitchen table, and without even looking up at me, he said, "I remember when I was a mommy and my son killed me." I froze in fear. I couldn't believe the chill that ran down my spine, and the fact that he didn't seem fazed by it at all. He just kept coloring his pirate ship. I need help. What the heck am I supposed to do? I don't even know how to process any of this. I don't believe in reincarnation or anything like that. Even if I did, is that even how it works? There shouldn't be an overlap in lives like this, right? But how else is something like this explained? It's not like my kid can just see the past and future. He has seen my whole life before. And from his perspective, he doesn't find it strange that my life used to be his. He is also aware enough to recognize a memory, like when I lost my job. And he comforted me knowing that I'll get a new job soon. This whole thing is hurting my brain. I love my son, but I'm so terrified and feel crazy. Someone, please help me. I don't know what to do. So my father used to own a cabin. In fact, he used to own a lot of different properties, which I suppose is just a roundabout way of saying that we grew up with money. Where things get a bit complicated is how he actually made that money. The line that he constantly fed us was that he was an accountant running his own firm in an office in the city. Long hours, lots of business trips. We never saw him much, and whenever we did, he always seemed tired, his eyes perpetually bloodshot, as if he were always trying to force them to stay open. He was sent off to prison right after I'd finished my first year of college. The sentence? 15 years, for washing hundreds of millions of dollars for numerous cartels. 2 weeks after he'd been booked, my mother committed suicide. As it turns out, she'd been helping him out through the entire thing and was facing some time herself. I guess she didn't want to deal with all that and took the drastic way out. A few months later, the government had seized pretty much all his property. All of it. Except for that cabin in the woods. It took a long time for me to feel normal again. But eventually I managed it. Went back to school and graduated with a good enough GPA, which allowed me to snag some shitty office job a few months later. But it was enough to pay the bills. Fast forward about another year, and I've basically scrubbed that entire sequence of events out of my brain. It took a little bit of therapy, a lot of psychedelics, but I finally did it. To the point where I was comfortable enough to go back to that cabin, the one place where I'd see my father for more than a few weeks at a time during our summer trips. I decided to take along 3 of my friends from uni, Jack, Pedro, Randy. We drove down there at the beginning of May. The road leading to the cabin hadn't been maintained at all, and as a result, it had become borderline undrivable. I decided to save my vehicle the stress and parked in a nearby lot, leaving us about a 1.5-mile trek through the woods, which really wasn't so bad. Our time in the cabin was pretty much spent getting drunk and stoned, and by the 3rd night, we had completely run out of food. We decided to take the 30-minute walk over to the nearest rest stop, where I knew that there was a 24/7 diner. So we go there, eat our meals, and on the way back we notice a burning smell in the woods, as if there was a bonfire raging about nearby. Of course, that was a bit strange given that it was around 2 a.m., but we didn't think too much of it at the time and we kept walking. It was only when the smell continued to grow stronger as we got closer to the cabin that we understood something was very wrong. Soon it had become suffocating, and we could see the night sky tinged with orange in the near distance. I felt my heart drop into my stomach and immediately I was sprinting. My worst fear realized as I reached the clearing where the cabin was located, completely up in flames, plumes of dark smoke blending in with the night. It was a mix of different emotions that hit me all at once, the combination of them creating a sense of dread so deep I hadn't thought it possible. After reeling myself in, I called 911, with the operator telling me that the fire department would be on their way, but wouldn't be able to reach us for at least 30 minutes. The 4 of us walked away from the cabin in silence, getting far enough so that the smoke was no longer scratching at our throats. Around 10 minutes later, we noticed that the orange tinge in the sky had suddenly disappeared. And I mean suddenly. Like gone in a single blink. I thought I might have been hallucinating, but it was clear from their expressions that my friends were seeing something similar. Cautiously, we started making our way back towards the cabin, noticing that the smoke was no longer heavy in the air, having cleared up considerably. Once we reached the clearing, it had disappeared altogether. I looked ahead, my brain working overtime to comprehend the sight before me. The cabin was no longer on fire, burnt to a crisp, sure, but the raging, overwhelming flames that had been consuming it just minutes prior had somehow completely fizzled out. The 4 of us looked between each other, as if to confirm we were all still seeing the same thing. Using the flashlight on my phone to survey the damage, I found pretty much what I'd expected. Complete destruction. Absolutely zero hope of recovering anything. I started taking some deep breaths, trying to calm myself down, when I heard Pedro yelling out from the other side. "Guys, where the fuck did this thing come from?" We all walked over to him. Nestled in the debris was the corpse of something. A monstrosity. It was about the size of a bear, with the sections of its body that weren't burnt showing pale, clammy skin with deep cuts etched throughout it, in what looked to be some kind of crude pattern. Its head had been smashed in, leaving nothing but an abnormally wide bottom jaw which was still bearing long black teeth. It had an uncountable number of long, thick arms that it was using to hold something that resembled a human infant, one that appeared to be completely unscathed, devoid of any burn marks. The longer I stared at it, the more that I was convinced I could see it breathing. It was a bizarre enough sight to put us into a near trance. What eventually snapped us out of it was the chanting. It was barely noticeable at first, slowly escalating in pitch, until it was clear that there were several human voices shouting in unison. Their tones were animalistic, their words strung together with just the bare beginnings of a rhythm. It sounded like they were speaking English, though I could hardly make out anything they were saying. The strangest part, though, was how quickly it was getting closer to us. Definitely not a walking pace. It was more like a sprint. The 4 of us shared a quick glance between each other, and immediately there was an understanding. We ran like bats out of hell, tripping over branches our own feet, but eventually we reached my car, all of us scrambling to pile into it. As I was fumbling for my keys, the chanting had become deafening, to a point that hardly made sense. It sounded as if there were speakers lined up in a circle around us, all blasting that horrible noise. And the second that I had put the keys into the ignition, things went silent. I found myself holding my breath as I looked up, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness, until what I was seeing was unmistakable. Several figures standing completely still at the edge of the woods. All human-shaped, but far too large to be people. All the air being held in my lungs flooded out with one big exhale, and I slammed the vehicle into drive and took a sharp turn before speeding the hell out of there, refusing to look in the rear view until we had made it into the highway. I drove until I had reached the rest stop, which was now hosting an absurd number of police cars. I parked, got out, and approached one of the cops, asking if they were here because of the fire. The cop shook his head. Fire? No. Has there been a fire? I explained the situation with the cabin to him, deciding to leave out the creature and the chanting for the time being. The cop nodded slowly, his expression remaining largely the same throughout. All right, he said. We'll look into it, and then give you an update in the morning. For tonight, just get a hotel or something. We exchanged numbers and I thanked him. As I began to walk away, he called out to me. Hey, can I ask you something? I turned back around. Yeah, I said. Sure. Do you happen to be my dad's named son? For a while, I just stared at him. Eventually, I nodded. Yeah, he said. I thought I recognized you. I don't understand, I told him. I've never seen you before. The cop took a deep breath before taking a quick look around. Come here, he said. Come close. Tentatively, I did so. I can't tell you everything. I don't even know everything. But I think you should have the right to know the truth about your father. All of the stuff that's happened here tonight. All of the shit that you've seen. It has something to do with him. He took another look around before continuing. Cartels, right? Was that the story they told you? It's not so creative. But I guess it doesn't have to be creative to be believable. 'Cause the shit that he was actually mixed up in, you would not believe unless you've seen it for yourself. What the hell are you talking about? I asked. Look, I have your number. I'll be in touch tomorrow morning. This is something I'm curious about as well. Maybe you can give me some answers, point me in the right directions. But not here. So get out of here before people start noticing you. And stay safe. I didn't feel like staying in a hotel that night. So I drove back into the city, dropping everybody off before arriving back at my own apartment. Of course I couldn't sleep that night. My eyes wired open into the morning as I waited for the officer to call. He still hadn't by the time that noon rolled around, and so I tried calling him instead. No answer. Eventually I did receive a call from the police, telling me that my father's cabin had burned down, and that it was due to a forest fire. I told them that wasn't possible because there had been no forest fire, and that I suspected foul play and wanted it to be investigated. It's already been investigated, are the exact words that the officer told me. Don't worry about it. Just get in touch with insurance. Go over your options. And before I could say anything else, he had hung up on me. It was a mixture of anger and curiosity that compelled me to drive back down there. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't for the road leading towards the rest stop to be blocked altogether. There were 2 cop cars guarding the barrier, with a single officer signaling any vehicles approaching to turn around. I pulled over to the side of the road, and after some careful deliberation, I decided to get out and approach him and ask what was going on, just to see what he might say. When I finished the question, he stared at me for a long time. Uncomfortably long. Emergency construction is what he eventually told me. After that encounter, I pretty much dropped trying to figure things out. Some weird things have started happening to me since. Every night I swear I can hear a baby crying in the apartment across from mine. The apartment that I thought had been occupied by a pair of college kids who definitely do not have children. That cop that was supposed to call me finally did, a few nights ago. When I answered, I was met with dead silence on the other end. Nearly 30 seconds of it until the line clicked dead. There's an abandoned house sitting across the street from my apartment building. One that's supposedly been there for years, because the development of the store meant to take its place keeps getting delayed. Somebody has started staring at me through its second-floor window. Whenever I catch them doing it, they're quick to close the blinds, so I can never catch any details. But I know that the moment I turn away from it, their eyes are back on me. I can't confirm that any of these things are related. Whether it has anything to do with my father, I just know that I don't want to deal with it, and that I want it to end.